On the morning of March the 3rd, 1967, a North Vietnamese soldier named Tuan lay in the tree line above a trail in the Central Highlands and watched an American walk toward the place where he was going to die. Tuan was certain of it. He had a machine gun and 40 men, and the high ground, and the American had none of those things. He had only a rifle and the bad luck to be walking point. The lead man came on slowly, reading the ground. Tuan could not know. His name was Daniel Kovac, 20, from a steel town in western Pennsylvania. He knew only two things about him. The first was that this was the man they had been told to kill above all others. The second was that they had tried to kill him before, twice. Both times, Tuan's officer had promised them it was done. Both times, the American had walked out of a kill zone that no one should have walked out of. His squad had died around him. He had not. And now here he was again on another trail, alive, walking point, as if the jungle simply refused to keep him. The ambush opened at a range of 30 meters, 40 rifles and a machine gun, all at once into a patrol of 9 men strung out along the trail. It was over in less than a minute. When the shooting stopped and the smoke thinned, Tuan looked down at the trail and counted the dead. And then he felt something cold move through him because one of the shapes down there was moving. It was the point man. It was Kovac. He was hit, and he was crawling, and he was still alive. For the third time, Tuan's officer had promised them the American would die. For the third time, the officer was wrong. And by the end of that year, the men of that regiment would stop calling him the American at all. They would give him another name. They would call him the Ghost, and they would come to believe quietly, against everything they had been taught, that there was one soldier in that valley who simply could not be killed. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand how one ordinary soldier becomes a ghost in the mind of an entire enemy regiment, you have to go back to the first time they tried to kill him, and you have to understand the man they were trying to kill. Armies do not fear individual men. That is the first thing to understand about this story. An army is a machine built to grind down individuals. It thinks in units and numbers and maps. A single enemy soldier, however brave, is a rounding error. He is not a threat. He is a statistic waiting to happen. So when an entire regiment begins to fear one man, begins to whisper about him, to plan around him, to give him a name, something strange has happened. Something has broken through the machine. That is what happened in that valley in 1967. And the strangest part is that the man at the center of it was not strange at all. Daniel Kovac was not a Superman. This matters, so hold on to it. He was not unusually large or unusually fast. He had not been a hero back home. He was a quiet kid from a mill town, the son of a steelworker, drafted at 19 like a million others. He was not the best shot in his company. He was not the strongest. If you had lined up his platoon and asked which of them would become a legend to the enemy, no one would have pointed at Kovac. He had exactly one quality that set him apart, and it was not a dramatic one. Daniel Kovac was very hard to kill, not because of some gift, because of how he was built, sort of on the inside, in a way that did not show. He did not panic. When the world exploded around him, something in him went cold and slow and clear instead of fast and afraid. And he had decided somewhere deep down, without ever saying it out loud, that he was going to go home. He was simply not willing to die in that valley. And he held to that with a stubbornness that the men trying to kill him would eventually mistake for something supernatural. He walked point. That is the last thing you need to know before the story begins. The point man walks first. He walks ahead of the whole patrol, alone, into whatever is waiting. He is the one the ambush is built for. He is the first to step on the mine, the first into the kill zone, the first to die. It was the most dangerous job in the infantry. and most men did it only when they had to. Kovacs did it by choice. He was good at reading the ground, and he trusted himself more than he trusted anyone else to keep the men behind him alive. So he took the worst job in the war and made it his own. Understand what that choice meant day after day? The point man has no one in front of him. He has only the trail and the jungle and whatever is waiting in it. Every step is a question with a fatal wrong answer. A wire strung across the path, a leaf turned the wrong way, a patch of ground that has been walked on too recently. The point man reads all of it alone, while the men behind him trust their lives to his eyes. Most soldiers walked point when the rotation forced them to, and were glad when it passed to someone else. Kovacs took it and kept it. He told himself the lie that every good point man tells, that he was better at it than whoever would replace him, and that if he did it himself, fewer of his friends would die. It was a lie that happened to be true, and it put him every single day in the exact spot the enemy built their traps to fill. Which is why, again and again, when the enemy sprang their trap, the man in front was always him. And why, again and again, the enemy would learn that the man in front would not stay dead. The North Vietnamese officer, whose job it became to kill him, was a captain named Vin. Vin was a professional. He had fought the French. He had come down the trail and survived things that killed most men. He did not believe in ghosts, and he did not believe in luck. He believed in planning and patience and the certainty that any man could be killed if you were willing to spend enough to do it. Daniel Kovac would test that belief to its breaking point. And in the end, Vin would be the one who gave him the name. The first time was an accident. That is worth saying plainly. The first time the enemy failed to kill Daniel Kovac, they were not even trying to kill him in particular. He was just the point man who lived when the rest did not. It was January of 1967. Kovac's company was sweeping a series of ridgelines near the Cambodian border, in country that belonged, in every way that mattered, to the North Vietnamese. The Americans owned the fire bases and the daylight. The NVA owned the trails and the nights and the ground in between. It was a war of patrols. You went out, you looked for the enemy, and the terrible truth of it was that the way you usually found them was by walking into them. Kovac's patrol found them on a trail below a ridge. He was 15 meters ahead of the rest, walking point, when something made him stop. He never could say exactly what. The ground was too quiet. A bird had gone silent. Some animal part of his brain pulled the reins before the thinking part knew why. He froze. He raised his hand. And in that half second of stillness, the ambush went off a heartbeat early. That heartbeat saved his life and no one else's. The men behind him, bunched on the trail, took the full weight of it. The machine gun walked down the line. Kovac, already dropping, already rolling toward the only cover there was, took a round through the shoulder and another that opened his scalp and filled his eyes with blood. He went down hard into the brush at the edge of the trail. And then he did the thing that would define him. He did not freeze, and he did not run. He went still. He lay in the brush bleeding, and he did not move, and he did not make a sound. The NVA came down onto the trail to finish the wounded and collect the weapons the way they always did. They walked among the dead. One of them passed within arm's reach of Kovac. He could hear the man breathing. He could hear him talking low and calm to another soldier. He lay there with his blood soaking into the dirt and his rifle under his body, and he did not move a muscle because he understood that stillness was the only weapon he had left. They took him for dead. In the smoke and the blood and the tangle of bodies, one more torn and motionless American was easy to miss. They stripped the weapons they wanted, and they faded back into the tree line, and they were gone. And Daniel Kovac lay in the brush and listened to them leave and kept lying there, unmoving, for a long time after, in case it was a trick. Only when he was sure did he begin, slowly, to crawl. The crawl is a thing he would never fully describe, not even years later. He went on his belly, one arm dead at his side, dragging his rifle by its sling when his good hand gave out. The blood from his scalp kept filling his eyes, and he kept stopping to wipe it clear against his shoulder, because a man who cannot see cannot tell the safe ground from the trap. He moved a few meters at a time. Then he lay still and listened, then a few meters more. Behind him, the sounds of the ambush had stopped, and the silence that replaced them was almost worse. He knew what that silence meant. It meant the men he had walked in front of were dead. He crawled most of a kilometer that way, and it took him hours. Somewhere in it, the shock wore off, and the pain arrived in full, and he crawled through that too, because stopping was the same as dying, and he had already decided he was not going to die. A relief patrol found him near dark, and even then half conscious, more blood than boy. Daniel Kovacs came up out of the brush with his rifle pointed at the men who had come to save him. He did not yet believe he was safe. It would be a long time before he believed that again. They carried him out. The medevac came and lifted him up and away over the same green valley that had just tried to swallow him. And within a few weeks, healed just enough to walk, he asked to go back. Back to his company, back to the same valley, back to Walking Point. The men who processed the request thought he was insane. He could not have explained it to them. He only knew that the valley had taken his friends and that he was not finished there. The NVA never knew that first time that they had left a man alive. They only knew later, when the reports came in, that the ambush that had wiped out an American patrol had somehow let one man crawl away. To Captain Vin, reading it, it was a small failure, an oversight, nothing more. He noted it and he filed it, and he did not yet know the man's name. That would come. The valley was not done with Daniel Kovacs, and he was not done with it. The second time, it was not an accident. And that is when the fear began. It was March, and Vin's regiment had moved back into the valley in strength. They were good at what they did. They studied the American patrols. They learned the routes, the habits, the times of day. And they began to notice something that did not make sense. On the American patrols that came out of the northern fire base, there was often a particular point man, the same one. A soldier who moved differently from the others, a slower, more careful, a man who seemed to smell the ground. Twice they set ambushes on his patrols. Twice the ambushes worked, the patrols were shattered, the Americans took losses. And twice, when the smoke cleared and the dead were counted, that same point man was not among them. He was hit both times. They saw him fall. And both times, somehow, he was gone by the time they came down to the trail, or he was lying so still among the dead that they passed him by, and later he was back. Healed, Walking Point again, as though nothing had touched him. Look closely at one of those 2 mornings, because the pattern lived in the details. It was gray and wet, near the end of March. Vin's men had set their guns along a bend in a stream bed, in good positions with the light behind them. They watched the American patrol come. They watched the point man come first, the same slow, careful walk, the same reading of the ground. This time, they were ready for him. This time, they would not fire early. They let him come deep into the kill zone. They let the whole patrol string out along the stream bed, and then they fired, all at once, exactly as doctrine told them to. The patrol was torn apart in seconds. Through the smoke, the NVA saw the point man go down, hit, folding into the rocks at the edge of the water. They were certain of him this time. They had watched him fall. But when they came down to collect the weapons, he was not in the rocks. There was blood there. There was a torn piece of his gear. There was no body. In the chaos and the smoke, in the handful of minutes between the fall and the search, the point man had dragged himself into the stream and let the current carry him down and under the overhanging brush, out of the kill zone entirely. They found the blood trail. They followed it to the water, and there it simply ended. To a rational man, it was a clever escape by a badly wounded soldier who knew his ground. To the young men of Vin's regiment, standing over a blood trail that vanished into a stream, it was something else. It was proof. The American had been shot again and had dissolved into the earth again and would be back again. You cannot kill water. You cannot kill a shadow. That was the morning the name truly took hold, and after it the name never let go. This is where the human mind does a particular thing, and it is worth pausing on. Vin's soldiers were not fools, and they were not cowards. They were hardened men who had seen every kind of death the war could offer. But even hardened men need the world to make sense. And when the same enemy soldier walks out of 3 kill zones that should have killed him, the sensible explanation that he was skilled and stubborn and lucky begins to feel thinner than the other one. The one that whispers that this man is different, that the normal rules do not apply to him, that he cannot be killed. They started to talk about him. In the camps at night, the soldiers of Vin's regiment began to trade the story of the American who would not die. Each telling made him a little larger. The wounds got worse. The escapes got stranger. Somewhere in there, they stopped using the ordinary words for an enemy soldier, and they started calling him the ghost, Con Ma, the one who is already dead and does not know it. The one you cannot kill because there is nothing left to kill. Captain Vin heard the talk, and it worried him more than the American did, because Vin understood something about armies that his soldiers did not. Fear is contagious. A regiment that believes there is one enemy who cannot be killed is a regiment that has begun to doubt. And doubt, in the kind of war they were fighting, was more dangerous than any single rifleman. If his men believed the ghost was unkillable, then every patrol became a place where the ghost might appear. Every trail, every night. One man had become a shadow that fell across the whole valley. So Vin made a decision. He would not leave the ghost to chance an ambush any longer. He would find out exactly who this man was. He would learn his patrol, his habits, his fire base. And he would build an operation for the single purpose of killing one American soldier. It was, when you say it plainly, an absurd thing for a regiment to do, to bend real resources, real men, real planning toward the death of one enemy private. Vin knew it was absurd. He did it anyway, because the thing he was really trying to kill was not the man, it was the story. Think about how strange that decision was. Vin commanded hundreds of men in a war against the most powerful military on earth. He had bridges to ambush, convoys to hit, fire bases to bleed. Every hour he spent thinking about one American private was an hour stolen from the real war. And Vin knew it. He was not a foolish man, and he did not become obsessed the way his young soldiers did, but he understood the arithmetic of morale better than they did. A regiment that half believes in a ghost fights worse. It hesitates on the trail. It flinches at the point man of every patrol. It carries a small, cold weight into every fight. Vin could not let that weight settle into his men, and there was only one way he knew to lift it. He had to produce the ghost's body. He had to show his soldiers a dead American on the ground and say, plainly, here is your ghost. He was only a man, and now he is meat like any other. Until he could do that, the story would only grow. So the story was the target. Kovac was just the way to reach it. It was around this time that a captured document, a page from a notebook, put a name to the ghost for the first time. The Americans in their own reports had begun to notice that the enemy in this valley seemed unusually interested in one soldier. And the name in the American reports, the name of the point man who kept walking out of ambushes, was Kovac. Vin finally had it. A name. Not a spirit, a man. Daniel Kovac. And a man, Vin told himself, could be killed. Here is the part of the ghost story left out. Because on the American side of that valley, there was no ghost. There was just a tired 20-year-old who was quietly coming apart and holding himself together and going back out anyway. Daniel Kovac did not feel unkillable. He felt the opposite. He knew better than anyone in his company exactly how thin the line was. He had lain in the brush and heard the enemy breathing. He had crawled through his own blood. He had carried pieces of his friends off of trails. He did not think he was protected. He thought he was living on borrowed time, and he knew the loan would come due. He simply refused to let that stop him from doing his job well enough to bring the men behind him home. The men in his company did not see a legend either. They saw something they could not quite name, and they were grateful for it. Kovacs on point meant fewer of them died. It was that simple. He had an instinct for the ground that could not be taught. He read a trail the way other men read a road sign. When Kovacs stopped, everyone stopped, and more than once that saved a platoon. So they followed him, and they watched out for him, and they did not ask too many questions about why the enemy seemed to want him so badly. In a war that made very little sense, a man who kept you alive was not something you questioned. What kept Kovacs going was not courage in the way we usually mean it. It was something smaller and harder and more human. He had made himself a promise. He was going home. He had a girl back in Pennsylvania and a father who had never once told him he was proud of him. And Daniel Kovacs had decided he was going to walk back into that mill town alive and hear the old man say it. That was the whole engine of it. Not glory, not country. A stubborn private refusal held so tightly that it looked, from the outside, like something more than human. And he paid for it. This is what the ghost story never told. Every escape cost him. He was wounded again and again. He carried scars on scars. He did not sleep. He flinched at silence. The thing that let him go, still in a kill zone, while men breathed inches from his face, that stillness had a price, and he paid it every night in the dark, lying awake, running the trails again in his head. The enemy thought they were failing to kill a man who felt nothing. In truth, they were failing to kill a man who felt everything and buried it and got up and went back out to Walk Point one more time. There was a night between patrols that one of his squad mates never forgot. The camp was quiet. Kovacs was sitting alone, cleaning a rifle that was already clean, running the cloth through it over and over, staring at nothing. The other man sat down beside him and asked if he was all right. Kovacs did not answer for a long time. Then he said quietly that he could still hear them, the men from the first trail. He said he heard the enemy breathing in the dark when he closed his eyes. He said he did not know if he was going to make it home and that he was going to keep walking point until he found out one way or the other. Then he finished cleaning the rifle and he wrote a letter home, the way he did before every patrol. He wrote to the girl in Pennsylvania. He never told her what it was really like. None of them did. He told her the food was bad and the weather was worse and that he would see her soon. He signed it and sealed it and set it where it would be found and sent if he did not come back. Then he lay down and did not sleep. And in the morning he got up and walked point again. That was a ghost on the American side of the valley. Not a spirit, not a legend. A frightened, exhausted, decent young man writing careful lies to a girl back home so she would not worry, hearing the dead breathe every time he closed his eyes and going out anyway. The enemy across the valley was building a myth about him. He was only trying to live long enough to mail the next letter himself. That is the thing about the men the enemy could not kill. They were almost never the men the stories made them out to be. They were not immune to fear or to death. They were ordinary men who had found something inside themselves to hold on to and held on past the point where holding on made any sense. Vin was hunting a ghost. He was actually hunting a homesick kid with a promise to keep. And that, it would turn out, was much harder to kill than any ghost. Vin built his operation carefully over several weeks. He was too good a soldier to be careless, even about something this strange. He learned Kovacs' firebase. He learned the patrol rotations. He learned that Kovacs' company ran a regular sweep through a particular stretch of the valley and that the terrain there funneled any patrol through one long, narrow draw. It was a perfect place for an ambush. Vin decided it would be the last place the Ghost ever walked. This time he did not send 40 men. He sent nearly 200. He set them in depth along the whole length of the draw on both sides, with machine guns sighted to cover every meter of the trail. He held a reserve back to cut off any retreat. It was not an ambush anymore. It was a killing ground built for a single purpose. Vin told his officers plainly what the purpose was. The American point man was to be killed, confirmed, and his death made certain. He would not walk out of this one. There would be nowhere to crawl. On the morning of the patrol, Kovacs walked point into the draw, and once again the thing that could not be taught reached up and grabbed him. Something was wrong. The draw was too still. There was no birdsong, no movement, none of the small living sounds that a real piece of jungle makes. He had walked into enough of these to know the particular silence of men waiting. He stopped. He raised his hand, and behind him the whole patrol froze on the lip of the draw, still up on the high ground, not yet committed to the low killing ground below. That stop is the reason there was a battle instead of a massacre. Vin's men, seeing the point man halt, seeing that the trap was about to be smelled out before it was fully sprung, opened fire early. And once again, that one stolen heartbeat changed everything. The Americans were not strung out helpless along the trail. They were on the high ground in cover, and though the fire that came at them was enormous, it did not catch them the way it was meant to. The draw erupted, 200 men and a dozen machine guns, and at the very front of it, alone in the open, was Daniel Kovacs. He should have died in the first 3 seconds. By every rule of that war, he should have. Instead, Kovacs did what he always did. He went cold and slow and clear. He found the only fold of ground there was and put himself into it. And he began with a calm his own men would talk about for the rest of their lives to fight his way back toward them. He was hit. Of course he was hit. But he kept moving and he kept shooting. And even as the ground came apart around him, he called the enemy machine gun positions up the slope by the clock and called the ranges in a voice so steady it did not sound like a man who was dying. It gave the platoon above him something to hold on to. If the Ghost was still working down there in the middle of all of it, then they could work too. Vin watched it come apart from a ridge across the valley through his binoculars. He had built the killing ground to funnel the Americans down into the low place where his guns could reach them. But the point man had stopped them on the high ground, and now the high ground was killing Vin's own men. He watched the American artillery begin to fall and walk up and down the length of his draw, methodical and enormous. He watched his companies committed to the ambush, unable to break free of it. And then he heard the sound he had come to hate above all others, the slow drone of a gunship circling in from the south. The gunship settled into its patient orbit, and its fire came down along the tree lines, where Vin's men were dug in. What Vin had meant to be the surgical killing of one soldier had become a catastrophe for his own regiment. His men had gone down into that low ground to kill a Ghost, and now they could not get out of it. Vin gave the order to withdraw. It came too late for many of them. He pulled back what he could save, and he left the rest in the draw he himself had chosen. The fight had lasted most of an hour. When it was over, the draw was full of Vin's dead, and Daniel Kovacs, hit twice more, out of ammunition, was carried up out of it by his own men, alive, again. Vin had spent weeks and 200 men and a river of ammunition to kill one soldier. He had built the perfect trap, and he had watched one more time as the Ghost was carried out of it, bleeding and breathing. Vin was a hard man and a professional, and he did not believe in spirits. But something in him gave up a little that day. Not the war. The war went on. What gave up was the belief that this one man could be killed by anything Vin was willing to spend. Daniel Kovacs did not die in that valley. He did not die in Vietnam at all. He was wounded that last time, badly enough that the war finally let him go. He had given it more than most men give, and it had taken from him more than most men have to give. And when they carried him out of that draw, his time on the trails was over. He healed slowly in a way the deepest wounds never quite finish. And then one day, exactly as he had promised himself, in the worst nights of it, Daniel Kovacs walked back into that mill town in western Pennsylvania. Alive. He had kept the promise. He had come home. The town did not throw a parade. Most of them did not by then. He got off a bus and walked the streets he had memorized on his worst nights, past the mill, the church, the diner, and it was all exactly as he had left it, and he was not. His father met him at the door. The old man who had never once said the words looked at his son standing there alive, and his face broke, and he said them. That was the moment Daniel Kovacs had been walking point toward for 2 years, not a medal, not a crowd. His father's face in a doorway and a few words he had crossed a war to hear. He had kept a promise to himself, and it had carried him all the way here to this. He almost never talked about it. That was true of so many of them. The men who had seen the worst of that war came home and folded it away somewhere and did not take it out again. Kovacs married the girl. He worked. He raised children who knew, in the vague way children know such things, that their father had been in a war, and did not know that, on the other side of the world, in the memory of men who had tried and failed to kill him, he had once been a ghost. He did not feel like a legend. He never had. He felt like a man who had been very lucky and who missed every day the men who had not been. He carried them with him, the ones who had not come home. That was the part no one in the mill town could see. He would be at a table or a ball game or a church pew, and for a moment he would not be there at all. He would be back on a trail in the Central Highlands, 15 meters ahead of men who were about to die, raising his hand, trying to stop something that had already happened a lifetime ago. He never talked about it. He never once told the story that, on the other side of the world, was still being told about him. He did not know it was being told. He would have been astonished to learn that anyone thought of him as anything but a man who got lucky in a place a lot of good men did not. And on the other side of that war, Captain Vin remembered him too. Vin survived Vietnam. He grew old in a reunified country, an old soldier with a lifetime of hard memories. And of all the things he had seen in all his years of war, the one he returned to again and again was the American he could not kill. Late in his life, speaking to someone who wrote it down, Vin talked about the ghost of that valley. He did not talk about him with hatred. He talked about him with something closer to awe, and something closer still to a strange kind of respect that only enemies can feel for one another. Vin had killed many men in his life and sent many more to their deaths, and most of them he had long forgotten. That is the truth of war that no one likes to say aloud. The dead blur together, but not this one. This one he remembered with perfect clarity into his old age, a man whose face he had never even seen clearly, only a distant shape on a trail, walking point, refusing to fall. Vin said that in some strange way the American had become the measure by which he understood his whole war. Everything his side had suffered and everything it had endured and everything it had refused to surrender, all of it somehow lived for him in that one enemy soldier he could never put in the ground. Vin said he had come to understand something in the years afterward about why he could never kill that one man. It was not that the American was protected or lucky or more than human. Vin had believed all of those things at different times, and none of them were true. What was true was simpler and harder. The American had decided, more completely than any soldier Vin had ever faced, that he was going to live. And a man who has truly decided that, who has burned away every other possibility and left only going home, is very nearly impossible to kill, because he will not give you the half second of surrender that death requires. He had met that once in that valley, in a tired boy walking point. And it had defeated a regiment. The two men never met. They never spoke. They never knew each other's faces, only each other's presence across a valley, one hunting and one refusing to be caught. And yet, in the strange arithmetic of war, they were bound together forever. Daniel Kovacs spent the rest of his life not knowing he had been a legend to his enemy. And Captain Vin spent the rest of his life unable to forget the one soldier who taught him that some men cannot be killed by force alone. Here is what I think the ghost of that valley really was. Because it was not a miracle, and it was not luck. And Vin, in the end, was right about that. An army that fears one man is not really afraid of the man. It is afraid of what he represents. Vin's regiment could account for tanks and artillery and gunships. Those were problems of firepower, and firepower could be measured and planned against. What they could not account for was a single human being who simply would not break, who took everything the war could throw at one man and got up and walked point again. That was not a weapon they had a plan for. And because they had no plan for it, it frightened them more than any weapon did. That is why they made him a ghost. It was easier to believe in a ghost than to believe the truth, because the truth was worse for them. The truth was that the thing they could not kill was not supernatural at all. It was just the human will turned all the way up in one ordinary man. And if it lived in one American man in one valley, then it might live in others. That was the real fear under the ghost story. Not one immortal soldier, a whole army of men who might, each of them, decide the same thing Daniel Kovacs had decided. There is one more thing worth saying, and it is the reason a story like this still matters 60 years on. The men who fought that war on both sides were not the giants that legends make of them. They were farmers and mill hands and students and sons. What they did that was remarkable, they did not do because they were more than human. They did it because in the worst moments they found a way to be fully human, to hold on to a promise, a friend, a reason to see the morning. Daniel Kovacs was proof of that. Walking point in a valley that wanted him dead. He was not a ghost. He was better than a ghost. He was a man who would not quit. And that, in the end, is the only kind of unkillable there has ever been. He was not the strongest man in his company, or the bravest by any measure you could put on a page. He was a homesick kid from a mill town who made himself a promise and refused, past all reason, to break it. His enemy threw a regiment at that promise and could not kill it. They tried and they tried, and in the end, an old man on the other side of the world spent his last years remembering the one soldier who taught him the limits of what force could do. They called him the ghost because they could not explain how a man could walk out of death that many times. But the truth was simpler than any ghost story and harder. You can kill a soldier. Any army can kill a soldier. But what no army can kill is a man who has already decided he is going home. They threw a regiment at that one stubborn promise for a year of their war, and they never could put him in the ground. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping. Not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, impossible stories of individual men and what they carried and what it cost them on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you're watching from today. And if someone in your family served in Vietnam, in any unit, on any side, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.